My name is Miles Thatcher, and I wasn't supposed to be in that cab. My car had chosen exactly the worst possible moment to give up on me. Right outside the towering glass doors of a conference center on the outskirts of Atlanta, where I'd spent the last 3 days delivering slide decks about fiscal projections and fielding awkward small talk over lukewarm coffee. I remember the moment the engine sputtered and died, how my chest sank as I turned the key again and again, met only by a lonely click. I glanced at my watch, tucked my phone into my pocket, and tried to problem-solve amid the chorus of honking commuters and idling rideshare cars. A frustrated sigh escaped me. Of course it died now. Of course this had to happen now, when all I wanted was to escape. I had been planning a quiet weekend alone at my family's cabin in Lake Revere for months, ever since April told me that the holidays had been too much, too crowded, too loud. We'd fought in that cramped condo kitchen over mismatched expectations. She wanted more family time, more gatherings, more noise. I wanted solace in the woods, the cool hush of pine trees, and the undisturbed surface of a lake at dawn. I needed air. I needed to think. After a silent, blistering quarter at work and our last sharp exchange of curt words over dinner, when I snapped at her for bringing her sister to a meeting I'd asked be private, I knew I had to get away. So I booked my flight, rented a car, secured a room at the cabin for 3 nights, and packed an overnight bag as if I could box up every frustrations I felt and carry them off to the wilderness. But now my car sat abandoned, wheels pointed toward nowhere, on a strip of cracked asphalt. The sun was setting behind smoky clouds, casting orange light across the cracked pavement. I squinted at the horizon, hoping for a break in the clouds, or a break in my luck. I thumbed the rideshare app on my phone, weighed the cab service's fare estimate against the growing dread of missing my solitude. I tapped accept, then watched the little car icon appear 2 blocks away. When the cab pulled up, I slung my overnight bag onto the back seat, plopped down beside the driver, and forced a polite smile. I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to be there, in that cabin, away from my phone, away from obligations. Tobias, the driver, didn't seem the sort to pry. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror as he pulled into traffic, gave a curt wave, and returned his gaze to the road. I strapped my seatbelt on and closed my eyes for a moment, leaning my head against the headrest. The hum of the engine, the soft thrum of tires on pavement, it was a lullaby I never realized how much I craved until I heard it. I felt my shoulders loosen as the city lights blurred into streaks. Summer humidity clung to the glass, and I exhaled, letting exhaustion flood through me. Half an hour later, Tobias slowed down, tapped his indicator, and turned onto a quieter street. "Sorry, sir," he said without turning around. "Second pickup. Shared ride." I didn't mind. I was too tired to care. "Sure," I managed, my voice hoarse. He nodded, pulled over, and a man in a crisp suit slipped into the seat beside me. Tall, sharp-suited, and carrying an expensive cologne, he gave a courteous nod before settling in. I offered my own nod in return and turned back toward the window, watching streetlights wobble in the reflection of rain-spattered glass. The man introduced himself as Julian, and we exchanged pleasantries. Weather, traffic, that predictable mix of small talk that never feels quite small enough. The silence that followed was comfortable at first, but then Julian leaned in, lowered his voice, and began to speak of his weekend plans. His tone was warm, an easy mix of confidence and vulnerability, and I listened, half distracted, as he described heading to meet someone special. "My fiancée," he said, though the words seemed too heavy, too decisive. He spoke of her with a poetry that made me look at him sideways. She's calm, elegant, reads a lot, mostly old novels by the lake. The rhythm of her breath is steady, her laughter soft, but genuine. I watched him talk, watched Tobias concentrate on the road, and felt something strange twist inside me. A taut string wound around my ribs. He went on without pause. The little house by the lake, the quiet breeze through the pines, the way she hummed old soul songs when she cooked breakfast. He described a scar on her wrist from a childhood fall off a bike, a detail so specific it stopped my heart for a beat. He talked about her favorite sweater, a soft gray knit, and how she liked her coffee sweet, heavy on the cream. Those were April's quirks. My wife's. Every syllable was mine, every borrowed memory landing like a blow. A silent fight in my chest erupted into a cold whirl of panic. My fingers tightened on the strap of my bag. I clenched and unclenched them, tried to focus on the road, on the hum of asphalt. but the ache wouldn't subside. I didn't speak. I stared out the window as rain began to streak the glass, each drop echoing like a footstep on a tin roof. Behind me, their voices carried on, Julian's full of anticipation, Tobias's polite murmurs of acknowledgement. I felt like a ghost, watching my own story unravel in their mouths. My cabin, our cabin, was Julian's destination. The address he recited matched the GPS coordinates on my phone. He pronounced Lake Revere with casual ease, unaware of the agony each word inflicted. I swallowed against a lump in my throat and closed my eyes, trying to will the world back into ignorance. When the cab doors opened at the end of that winding gravel path, I hesitated to leave. I watched Julian step out, draw in a deep breath of pine-scented air, and say thank you to Tobias. I sat, frozen, as he strode toward my cabin, as April's silhouette appeared in the window, and as the threshold of my home became the stage for a betrayal I'd overheard. I swallowed one more time, drew in a steadying breath, and said, "Pull over." The words felt like a surrender and a beginning. I watched Tobias navigate out of the city's orange dusk glow and onto the open highway, the cab's tires humming like a reassuring heartbeat beneath me. My thoughts were still spinning from the engine's betrayal half an hour ago, but I reminded myself that none of that mattered anymore. The car was gone, my destination was clear, and all I needed was quiet. That's why I barely noticed him at first, the man who slid into the seat beside me without fanfare. He closed the door with a soft click and offered a polite nod in my direction. I glanced at him in the mirror. Tall, lean, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that reminded me of something you'd see worn by a corporate shark, and there was an air of control about him, a confidence anchored in the crisp lines of his tie. Maybe I admired it in a different man. All I felt was curiosity. Tobias cleared his throat. "Shared ride. Hope you don't mind the extra company." His tone was friendly, but professional, no small talk, no probing questions. I shook my head, rubbed my temples, and offered, "It's fine." My voice was rough, like a creaky hinge, but neither Tobias nor the man beside me commented further. I stared ahead as the road flattened out, swallowed up by rows of pines that danced past in the cab's headlights. In the rearview mirror, I saw the stranger settle in, shifting his bag to rest carefully between his knees, then placing his hands on the seat back in front of him. His posture was deliberate, every movement precise. After a minute, curiosity overcame my exhaustion. "Heading far?" I asked, gesturing toward the luggage he'd tucked neatly beside him. He turned his head, gave me an appraising look, and then his face relaxed into a genuine smile. "Just a few miles past your stop," he said, his voice warm and measured. "I'm meeting someone." He paused, then nodded toward me. "You are too." He sounded almost hopeful for camaraderie, as if we were two travelers bound by the same escape plan. I shrugged. Cab broke down. I called this one to get to my cabin at Lake Revere. The words came out blunt, but I felt obligated to explain why I was in the cab at all. "Weekend getaway." He nodded again, eyes flicking back to the road, then turned toward me. "Lake Revere, nice. I've heard it's peaceful." His gaze was thoughtful, as if he'd once stood on its shore and let the water wash over his worries. "My fiancée lives out there," he added casually, as though he couldn't believe his own luck that April, my wife, had found another man with just as much right to our cabin as I did. I felt something twist inside me, but forced my features to stay neutral. Tobias merged onto a highway ramp, and the cab lurched slightly, reminding me I was still in motion, still headed somewhere. I leaned forward and flicked the overhead light on, then off again, letting its dull glow vanish before it woke anyone else. There was a long pause, filled only by the soft droning of the engine. Then the man said, "Name's Julian." He extended a hand across the narrow space, and I shook it, his grip firm, reassuring, the kind you'd expect from someone who's used to closing deals. "Miles." I kept it short, held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The cab rattled over an uneven patch of asphalt, and I thought I saw shock, or maybe it was relief, flicker in his eyes. He didn't comment, simply leaned back and studied me, as though he was cataloging my expression, trying to decipher what kind of story I carried. "I've done my share of business trips," he said conversationally, "but nothing compares to family time. My fiancée, well, she's been waiting for me out there." He inhaled deeply, the scent of his cologne drifting over my shoulder. It was crisp, slightly citrusy, An expensive fragrance I'd worn on my wedding day before divorce was even a word in our marriage. I swallowed hard, forced my jaw to unclench. Sounds like she's worth the wait. My voice trembled a bit, and I caught Tobias' eyes in the mirror for an instant of apology. He gave a sympathetic half-smile and focused back on the road. I looked at Julian. He turned back to stare out the window. His reflection flickered in the glass, soft rain beginning to speckle the highway lights. After a few moments, Julian started describing her. How she laughed when she heard his bad jokes. How she'd wait by the water's edge until he returned from work. How she always wore that soft gray sweater that made her look warm even on the coldest fall morning. His words tumbled out like poetry, careful, practiced, but heartfelt. He mentioned a small scar on her wrist from a childhood bicycle accident, an intimate detail delivered with a tenderness I would once have reserved for April alone. The memory stabbed my chest. I clenched my fists on my lap, knuckles whitening, and felt betrayals bubble to the surface. Every description was a thread of my own life unraveling in front of a stranger, and every syllable tightened the knot in my throat. Still, I said nothing. I just watched the rain pick up, each droplet tracing luminous streaks across the window pane. Tobias eased the cab past a cluster of neon signs advertising lakeside cottages and fishing charters, and I realized we were near the turnoff. I inhaled, opened my mouth to speak, perhaps to tell Tobias to keep driving or to warn Julian that he'd chosen the wrong cabin, but no words came. My throat was raw, and I was too tired to fight for control. Instead, I sat back and closed my eyes, willing myself to breathe evenly, ignoring the jagged pulse in my ears. When the cab slowed, Tobias announced, "Fourth left up here." Julian pointed without turning, and Tobias followed his gesture into the gravel road that led to my cabin. I felt a trembling spread through my limbs, a cold dread that froze my blood. Tobias glanced at me in the mirror. "You okay back there?" His concern was real, brotherly, an ally I'd never met but somehow trusted. I swallowed and said, "Yeah, just pull over." The cab coasted to a halt in a small clearing, headlights illuminating the outline of my home's blue shutters in the distance. Julian gathered his bag and gave me a final nod, as if to say, "See you soon." Then he climbed out, his silhouette swallowed by the rain and the dark path. Tobias exhaled slowly. "Want me to take you anywhere else?" I lifted my head, rain dripping onto my forehead from the cab's open exhaust vent. My vision blurred against tears I refused to let fall. "No," I said softly. "Wait." I pocketed my phone, glanced at the cabin's distant glow, and said, "Actually, just wait here." The cab sat idling, tail lights blinking like distant fireflies. I drew a shuddering breath and opened the door, stepping into the cold rain with damp resolve. The night air bit at my collar and cleared my head. I stared at the door I'd built memories inside, at the lights spilling through curtained windows, and then I started walking. Julian's words echoed in my mind as I stood on the porch under the steady drum of rain, the hood of my jacket shielding my damp hair, but doing nothing for the torrent in my chest. I watched Tobias's cab idling just off the driveway, its red taillights glowing through the sheets of water, and I felt the betrayal tightening its vice around my ribs. Every syllable Julian had spoken about this mysterious woman by the lake had been drawn from my life. Her favorite sweater, her humming, the scar on her wrist that was traced with childhood pain, my April. I had never known she'd let him in this deep, or that her memories of us had become his stories to share. I closed my eyes, breathed in the damp scent of pine and wet earth, and steeled myself. I needed to hear the rest. I needed proof before confronting the illusion that had replaced my own history. I tiptoed across the creaking porch, each wooden board squealing underfoot like an exposed nerve ending. The light spilling through the living room windows was warm and golden, contrasting with the cold gray darkness that surrounded me. I pressed my palm against the glass, peering into the room where April stood with Julian. Her soft gray sweater clung to her frame, and her hair, dampened by the drizzle he'd escorted her through, curled gently around her face. She held a wine glass in one hand, full of the red Merlot we'd once shared on anniversaries, and she lifted it in midair, as if toasting someone. Julian's back was to me, and I watched his tailored suit silhouette against the lamplight, a figure of polished composure. He raised his glass to meet hers, and for one suspended second, they looked like the prototypes of a perfect couple, as though they'd rehearsed this moment for months. My chest went cold. The house we had painstakingly refurbished together last summer, the fresh paint on the shutters, our carved initials on the porch swing, even the scent of cedar that wafted through the hallway, had become the backdrop for a clandestine affair. I wanted to smash the window, scream for them to stop, to fall to my knees and beg April to remember me, but I stayed still. I let the silence envelope me, a mournful shroud that seared into my bones. I could hear April's soft voice carrying across the threshold, telling Julian something that made his head tilt, that made him laugh in that warm way she used to coax out when she wanted to make me smile. My heart pounded so fiercely I could taste it on my tongue, metallic and raw, and I placed a fist against the glass, fingertips trembling, as if I could claw my way back into the life I was losing. Behind me, Tobias honked softly. I turned, expecting him to call me back to the cab, to tell me it was dangerous, that I should leave. Instead, he remained silent, his figure blurred by the rain and the distance. I realized he'd become my only witness as I watched my wife's devotion shift from me to a stranger's arms. For years, trees whispered overhead, waves lapped against the private dock, and the cabin had been our sanctuary. Now it felt like a stage for a betrayal too vast for words. I swallowed and stepped back, heart still hammering, and then noticed that the front door had opened just enough for April to step outside. She didn't see me at first, as if the rain had obscured me entirely. But when she finally looked up, recognition flickered in her eyes. My breath caught. Would she be ashamed? Would she beg me to stay away? Or would her shock turn to anger that I'd been eavesdropping, that I'd invaded her new life? She took a hesitant step forward, toes already damp from the porch's dripping boards. Julian stayed inside, watching through the glass. I held the door frame to steady myself. April's eyes filled with confusion at first, then something harder, something colder. Because in that moment, our shared past dissolved, and she saw me not as her husband but as a voyeur, an interloper. Miles. Her voice was tentative, like the echo of a memory she couldn't quite place. I forced a half-smile that felt more like a grimace. "Julian," I said, nodding toward the cab across the driveway. Then I looked back at April. "Nice sweater." The words were simple but lanced through the damp air with pointed clarity. She swallowed. The silver scar on her wrist, the one I'd traced with my thumb one sleepless night after she'd dreamed of our wedding day, gleamed like a metronome counting my heartbreak. I wondered if Julian knew what that mark had meant to us. April's lips trembled. Wet from the rain or unshed tears, it was hard to tell. She stepped forward until she occupied the same threshold where I had once welcomed her home, her hand grazing the door frame I'd painted myself. "You heard," she whispered, voice barely louder than the rain. I nodded. I didn't flinch, though every part of me ached to reach for her, to pull her into my chest and convince her that no one could describe her better than I could. But I drew my arms to my sides, my overnight bag swinging from one shoulder, a symbol of my departure, the distance I'd chosen in silence. "I did," I said, voice low. "And I saw." I let the words hang between us like broken glass. She glanced behind me at Tobias's cab, then back at me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. She looked at me as though seeing me for the first time, as though the man standing in the rain was a stranger. "I never meant you to find out this way. It just happened." She hesitated, eyes brimming with guilt, and I felt the tight knot in my gut loosen slightly, not because I forgave her, but because her regret made the rupture even more real. She had chosen him, woven him into our story, erased my place with stolen details. I closed my eyes, inhaled the sharp scent of pine and betrayal, and exhaled slowly. "It happened," I agreed. "But it's over." I left the words like a final benediction and stepped away from the door, each footfall echoing on the wet porch. I returned to the cab, slid inside, and closed the door without looking back. Tobias didn't speak, but his presence felt like a lifeline as we pulled away, leaving the cabin's warm light behind and the ruins of a love I once believed would last forever. Rain spattered against the cab's windshield as I sank into the leather seat, my heart thundering in my ears like a war drum. The brief glow of the cabin's porch light vanished behind us as Tobias backed the cab onto the gravel road. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, images of April's gray-sweatered silhouette burned into my mind. The freight train revelation of hearing our life retold by Julian, my own memories recycled as his romantic anecdotes, had smashed something inside me. I closed my eyes, willing the storm in my chest to abate, but the thunder only grew louder. Every syllable Julian had spoken replayed endlessly in my head, the first time she hummed that old soul song while chopping onions, the exact coordinates of the little yellow cafe table where he'd first glimpsed her smile. He had described the rainstorm that drenched them, the same downpour when April and I had sheltered beneath a canopy of oak trees, her red scarf wrapped around her neck. He told it with such deliberate care I felt my own story unravel like a frayed ribbon in his hands. I squeezed my eyes shut, cursed myself for not speaking up sooner, for letting him narrate my world without resistance. Tobias eased onto the highway, the cab's tires rolling over glistening pavement. His presence offered a semblance of safety, but I barely registered his silent concern. I stared at the back of his head, memorizing every line. I wanted to shout, to claw at the window until it shattered, to demand he explain how he could so casually appropriate the chapters of my marriage. But words felt inadequate, hollow echoes against the avalanche of grief cresting inside me. Instead, I waited for the words I needed to surface, tasting them on my tongue like ash. The cab's interior was dim, illuminated only by the faint glow of the dashboard. I flexed my fingers, fingertips tingling as though they had fallen asleep. The weight of the overnight bag at my side grounded me. It was the only reminder that I still existed outside of that stolen narrative. I reached in, unzipped the compartment, and fingered the soft leather cover of our wedding photo album. My breath hitched. I hadn't dared look at it since I discovered the affair, stored away to avoid the collapse of memories I could no longer trust. But now, pressing that fragile boundary between past and present, I needed to hold something real. I closed the album shut, careful not to show Tobias. The click of the zipper jolted me back. I looked up at the rearview mirror and saw his eyes. Gentle, encouraging. "You want to talk about it?" he asked quietly. His voice was a lifeline, a reminder that I didn't have to shoulder this alone. I swallowed hard, adrenaline waning to exhaustion, and shook my head. "Not yet," I whispered, voice raspy. He nodded, refocused on the road, and let me drown in my own silence. Outside, the world blurred into streams of headlights and neon bakeries closing for the night. The miles between me and the cabin stretched out infinitely, a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm yawning between April and me. I wondered if she felt the same loss, if the rhythm of her new love had drowned out the once familiar cadence of our shared life. I pressed my palm against the window, fingertips splayed, as though searching for the echo of her hand beneath mine. The glass was cold and unyielding. After a long pause, I turned to Tobias. "Can you take me to the old bridge by the lake?" I asked, voice firmer. He glanced at me, eyebrows lifted, then nodded. "Sure thing. Why there?" I hesitated only a moment. "It's where everything started." His cab veered off the highway, and the scenery shifted to towering pines and mist-covered water stretching into darkness. The lake was a mirror of the sorrow within me, still, infinite, inscrutable. When we reached the wooden planks of the bridge, its boards slick with rain, Tobias pulled over and killed the engine. The cab fell silent, the world outside reduced to falling drops and distant owls. I opened the door, the smell of wetwood and moss flooding my senses. Tobias reached across and placed a steadying hand on my arm. "I'll wait for you," he said gently. I nodded, his solidarity as salve on my rawness, and stepped onto the bridge. Each footstep sank into the dripping wood, the cold seeping through my shoes. I walked to the center, leaned against the railing, and stared down at the ink-black water. Memories surfaced, the way April's hair had stuck to her cheeks when the rain caught us unawares, the soft laughter that had tumbled between us as we shook off the drops. Those were my memories, raw, unfiltered, ours alone. I swallowed hard, pressing my fists to my chest as if to ward off the pain threatening to break me. The wind picked up, tugging at my jacket, as though the lake itself sought to strip away my defenses. I closed my eyes and pictured April's face, her hesitant smile when she first told me she loved me. I let tears slip free, trailing down my cheeks in warm rivulets. It was the first honest moment I'd allowed myself since the cab ride began. I didn't care who saw. My story had been hijacked, my memories sprawled out like prey for an outsider's narrative. Tonight, I reclaimed them here, where the wind and water would bear witness. When I opened my eyes, the rain had softened to a mist. I turned back toward the cab's dim outline on the shore. Tobias sat behind the wheel, headlights off, waiting without judgment, without hurry. I inhaled deeply, a resolution hardening within me. I would speak to April. I would demand the truth of her words, of her intentions. I would face Julian. no longer as a helpless listener, but as the author of my own life's next chapter. I squared my shoulders, brushed rain from my brow, and walked back across the bridge with feet steadier than before. The storm inside me had not passed, but I was no longer adrift in someone else's tale. I was ready to write my own. I stood on the dew-slick gravel path leading to our cabin, every nerve ending thrumming with raw tension beneath the thin fabric of my jacket. The rain had eased into a gentle mist, droplets clinging to the blue shutters we'd painstakingly painted together, their color dimmed by the soft glow of the porch light. It felt surreal, as if I'd shifted into someone else's story and was now trespassing within its borders. Yet this was my home. My memories were etched into every floorboard and window pane, every knot in the pine walls, and every curve of the cedar railing. But tonight those personal landmarks pulsed with the electric sting of betrayal. I drew a deep breath of damp air, trying to steady the storm within me, and gripped the strap of my overnight bag. I had come back here expecting solitude, distance from obligations, a chance to untangle my thoughts. Instead, I had discovered that my life had quietly become someone else's narrative. The door stood ajar, its latch unlatched in my haste to slip inside unnoticed. I hovered in the threshold, the space between wet air and dry warmth feeling like the gap between past and present. The living room lamp cast a warm rectangle on the floor, illuminating the worn rug we'd chosen together and the couch whose cushions bore the indentations of evenings spent in contented conversation. I could almost hear April's laughter bouncing off the walls, that soft, lyric sound that had once guaranteed safety against any storm. Now it seemed like an echo in someone else's hall. My fingertips brushed the carved initials on the door frame. M+A, our promise carved deep into the wood by my own hand last autumn, and I recoiled as if it were a brand. I stepped in, the familiar scent of lavender and cedar washing over me, mingled with the faintest trace of Julian's cologne. He wasn't here anymore, but his presence seemed to hang like a cloud in the corners of the room. I scanned the space. The coffee table strewn with open mail and a single wine glass left half full, droplets beating on its rim, the bedroom door slightly ajar, revealing rumpled sheets. Everything was in place, yet nothing felt mine. My pulse thundered so loudly I feared the walls might hear it. I walked through the living room, each footstep echoing on polished floorboards, and passed by the framed photo of April and me standing on the dock, sunlight dancing across the lake and her smile radiant. I reached out, fingertips trembling, and traced her face in the glass before turning away. I crossed into the kitchen, the fluorescent light flickering above the sink where a single mug rested, its gray glaze matching her favorite sweater. I remembered the mornings I'd found her humming as she poured coffee, the gentle melody a balm for my early morning anxieties. Now that mug felt like a relic of a past life, an artifact of a chapter that had ended without warning. My stomach knotted. I ran a hand through my hair and glanced around, half expecting April to step through the swinging pantry door, to see my face and fling herself into my arms in repentance. But there was only silence, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the muted ticking of the wall clock marking time I no longer recognized. At the back door, I paused before the windowed panel that overlooked the dock and the dark expanse of Lake Revere. The water lay still, smooth like a pane of black glass reflecting faint starlight. I could see the outline of my fishing pole leaning against the railing, the tackle box unopened for weeks. This refuge, this sacred place of renewal and quiet contemplation, had become a theater for a secret love affair. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, my breath fogging the surface, and closed my eyes. I saw April and Julian there, their silhouettes merging with shadows, their whispered words becoming betrayals I'd never fully comprehend. And yet, in that very moment, I felt something shift, my heart refusing to remain hostage to their deception. I stepped away from the door and moved toward the stairs leading to the loft, where our bedrooms faced each other. Every step felt heavy, as if I were trudging through mud. On the landing, I paused, hand resting on the banister carved with my initials. The loft window looked out to the rising moon, casting silver light over quilted blankets and wooden bedposts. I remembered nights spent sleepless beside April, sharing hopes and fears in the hush of dreams. Now, solitude felt like both punishment and liberation. I hesitated before the bedroom door, taking a moment to gather myself. Then I pushed it open. Inside, the room was awash in golden lamplight. The bed was made, neatly, with hospital corners, a testament to April's exacting standards. On the bedside table lay a folded note in her handwriting. My breath caught. I approached it slowly, feeling as if each footfall moved me deeper into unfamiliar territory. I unfolded the paper with care, recognizing the curve of her letters. The note read, "Miles, I never intended for this to hurt you. I need time to think. Please don't come back until you hear from me." My chest clenched as I read and reread the lines, the words both apology and barrier. I wanted to crumble, to scream, to beg her to stop writing her life without me. Instead, I folded the note carefully, slid it back onto the table, and exhaled. I turned away, crossed the room, and paused at the window. The moonlight revealed ripples where a breeze caressed the water's surface. In that serene scene, I felt the first flicker of resolve. My marriage, my home, my shared history had been interrupted, but they were not erased. I drew a deep breath, feeling the cold night air fill my lungs and clear the fog of shock. I reached into my bag and retrieved my phone, scrolled to the lawyer's number I'd saved earlier. I debated, could our refuge be reclaimed, or must I build a new story from these shards? My finger hovered over the call button. Suddenly, a different kind of calm washed over me, one born not of denial, but of choice. I tucked the phone away and turned off the lamp, letting the moonlight guide me back down the stairs. I paused at the door, hand on the knob, and looked back once more at the room where our marriage had been both nurtured and dismantled. I exhaled a steady breath, closed the door behind me, and locked it. I returned to the living room, sank onto the couch, and stared at the windows reflecting the silent lake beyond. The cabin had been my sanctuary. Tonight it was a crucible. But as dawn approached, I knew that when the first light broke over the water, I would stand beside it not as a victim, but as the one who chooses what comes next. The cab rumbled along the wet asphalt, tires hissing softly as Tobias steered up the winding road toward my sanctuary. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it over the engine's hum, every beat a thunderclap in my chest. I gripped the edge of my seat, knuckles white, as the world outside shifted from dark pines to the familiar curve where the gravel drive branched off into the shadows. My throat went dry. I forced myself to breathe, to feel the cool air that seeped in around the slightly cracked window, reminding me that I was still alive, still myself. I dared not glance at Julian beside me, that unknowing interloper filling my memories with lies, so I stared ahead at the headlights carving paths through the mist. A trembling ran through me, as if the very bones in my body were quivering in anticipation of the betrayal I knew was coming, yet could do nothing to stop. Then I heard Julian's voice, casual and expectant. "That's the road. Can you turn up there?" He pointed with an easy hand toward the veering path beneath the sagging boughs of pines. Tobias nodded, shifted gears, and the cab veered onto the gravel, each small stone clicking against the undercarriage like a warning. I pressed back into the seat, every muscle taut, as our headlights spilled over the blue shutters and the carved initials on the porch swing, evidence of countless shared summers, countless promises. Julian leaned back, stretched his shoulders, and smiled as though he were returning to his childhood home, not mine. "Thanks, man," he said. "Hope your weekend's as good as mine." I nodded slowly, lips pressed together, feigning nonchalance, but my hands shook the entire time, trembling against the leather seat. The cab came to a gentle stop just beyond the tidy garden beds I had planted last spring, rows of lavender and rosemary that now bent beneath the drizzle. Julian opened the door, the hinge squeaking in protest, and swung himself out with practiced ease. He hauled his bag onto his shoulder, took a moment to look around as if seeing it fresh for the first time, and inhaled deeply, the crisp scent of pine and rain-filled air filling his lungs. My chest tightened watching him, the way he paused on my doorstep as though this was exactly where he belonged. Tobias killed the engine, leaving the stillness so complete I could hear Julian's boots crunching on the stones as he strode toward the front door. My pulse thundered. I felt faint, as though my legs might give way any second. I didn't move, didn't speak. I simply watched. From my corner of the back seat, I could see April through the window of the living room, stepping into view in her gray sweater, hair damp against her neck. She glanced once toward the path, spotted Julian as he approached, and her expression shifted from curiosity to a warm welcome. She set down the wine glass sitting in the windowsill, the glass catching the porch light's glow and refracting it into the gloom. Their lips met as Julian greeted her, a soft brush of lips that was more intimate than anything I had ever shared with her. My vision blurred, and I blinked to clear tears I refused to let fall. The warmth of the living room, which had once been the cradle of our best memories, now radiated betrayal back at me through the glass. I realized then that my cabin, my haven, had been laid out like a red carpet for him, an invitation I'd never seen until it was too late. Tobias glanced back at me in the mirror, concern etched into his features. He opened his mouth, likely ready to ask if I wanted to go somewhere else. I met his eyes for a brief moment and shook my head, voice lost in the storm inside me. I couldn't return to the city, not yet. Instead, I whispered, "Wait here." The word was a vow, a promise to myself that I would not, and could not, just vanish. I needed to witness this final act before drawing my curtain on a life rewritten around me. Tobias switched off the dome light. The cab sank into darkness save for the faint glow of the dashboard. He offered a sympathetic nod through the rearview mirror, then shut his door, leaving me alone in a cocoon of mechanical silence. I opened the door and stepped out into the mist-softened night, every droplet on my jacket a tiny hammer on my nerves. The gravel shifted under my boots as I crossed the yard, each footfall deliberate. My stomach churned, but I forced myself onward, driven by a desperate need for clarity. As I approached the porch, April and Julian still stood close, their bodies angled toward each other with an intimacy I was no longer part of. I watched April lift her hand, brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear, and speak to him in a tone that once soothed me in moments of turmoil. Now it resonated like a dagger. I watched Julian's response. That practiced charm and gentleness mirrored my every memory of her laughter and warmth. I swallowed around a lump in my throat, braced myself, and lifted my hand to knock. When April turned and saw me at the top step, her eyes widened, blood draining from her cheeks. Julian stepped back, confusion flickering across his face. I stood there in the rain, bag slung over my shoulder, shoulders squared against the storm. No fury erupted from my chest, only a hollow calm that came from facing the truth. I stood in the space where our life had been most secure and let the silence fill the void between us. The cabin's windows framed the tableaus of our undoing. The wine glass, the carved swing, the pines bending in the whisper of rain. I breathed in, tasted the cold on my tongue, and prepared to step inside this final scene, not as a victim, but as the one who would decide how the next act played out. I stood in the doorway, rain-slicked and trembling as the world I once knew unraveled before me. April's face had shifted from surprise to something fiercer, colder, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Julian lingered at her side inside the warmly lit hall, his polished shoes half hidden by the threshold's welcome mat. The wine glass lay forgotten on the windowsill, droplets of deep burgundy clinging to its rim, a silent witness to the intimacy they'd shared. For a long moment, I simply watched, letting their shock settle around me like dust. My chest felt empty, hollowed by the betrayal I discovered, yet beneath that hollow space something new stirred, a fierce clarity that came from knowing exactly what I would not become. April's eyes met mine, and I saw the panic there, the voices in her mind scrambling for an explanation that would make sense of my presence in her new life. She parted her lips, as though about to apologize, to fling herself into the reassurance that all would be forgiven. Julian's gaze flicked between us, confusion etching lines around his eyes. He took a cautious step forward, as if measuring whether he belonged. I breathed in the scent of cedar and lavender that clung to the cabin's interior, a fragrance I had once associated with comfort. Now it tasted of lies on my tongue. "I was in the cab, Julian," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my limbs. I paused to let the words resonate. He blinked, as though realizing I'd eavesdropped, overheard every word of his rehearsed declarations. I offered him a slow, almost casual nod. "I heard your whole love story. Pretty touching." His eyes widened, hurt flashing across his features before confusion reclaimed its place. "I listen, Miles. I didn't know," he stammered, but I held up a hand to stop him. I turned my gaze to April, who stood with her shoulders hunched, guilt wringing her hands in front of her. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, but the words poured out clear as a bell. "You decorated," I said, stepping inside as though claiming territory I'd never lost. My boots left wet footprints on the rug we'd chosen together. Nice touches. The new throw pillows, that painting over the mantel. Serenity on the lake. You always said it was too cliché. I let that hang, watching her flinch at the memory. "That painting was mine," I added softly, the sting of reclamation sharpening my tone. I picked it out for our anniversary. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came. Julian's jaw clenched. He took an involuntary step back, hands lifting as though to ward off my words. I moved deeper into the living room, every footfall measured, deliberate. I ran my hand along the back of the couch, its fabric still soft beneath my fingers, and let my fingertips linger on the seam where we'd carved our initials that hot July afternoon. I kept coming back here in my mind, I said, voice low, thinking how it would feel to sit out here by myself. I nodded toward the sliding glass door leading to the porch. Never imagined I'd see someone else sitting here with my memories. I faced April again, eyes void of anger but bright with unshed tears. How long has this been going on? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The faint lines around her eyes betrayed many sleepless nights, many whispered phone calls, many stolen moments hidden behind my back. Her lips trembled as she whispered, since spring. Spring, when I thought we were reconnecting over weekends by the water, when I believed her laughter had me unraveling in the best possible way. I remembered the flowers budding outside the cabin, the first warm breeze carrying promise, and she remembered it as a time to slip away with another man. The earth seemed to shift beneath me as her words settled into my soul. I closed my eyes for a moment, drew in a steadying breath, and exhaled. The weight of grief pushed down on me, but I let it pass through, acknowledging it, not letting it bury me. April, I said, voice gentler now, though each syllable bore the weight of what was lost, you owe me the truth. She turned away, her shoulders shaking, and I heard the blossom of her tears in the silent cabin. Julian stayed where he was, his hands shoved into his pockets, as though unsure whether to intervene or retreat. I took a step closer to her, closing the small gap between us. Why? I asked softly. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. I was unhappy, she admitted. We barely talked. You were always working. You withdrew. I felt the familiar pang of guilt. Yes, I had buried myself in work. Yes, I had neglected her in ways I tried to justify. But those failings did not entitle her to betrayal, did not make our years together a free gift to be retold by another's lips. She tried to reach out, but I held up a hand. Don't, I said. You can't erase me. And yet I felt something shift, rage folding into sorrow, sorrow blooming into resolve. I watched as she sank to her knees on the rug, head bowed, and Julian knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back in a gesture I once would have done without hesitation. I realized then that I had a choice, to lash out, to scream, to reclaim my pain through vengeance, or to lift myself from this wreckage and walk away with dignity intact. I swallowed, and for the first time since I'd heard their laughter through the window, I felt a quiet calm settle in my bones. I won't stay, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. I turned to leave, each step lighter than the one before as though shedding a burden. I'll stay at the motel down the road, I told Tobias later, as I sank into the back seat, exhausted but free. Tomorrow, I'll figure out what comes next. As Tobias drove away, the cabin receded into the mist, its windows darkening behind us. I watched the silhouette of my home fade, tears finally falling, not of despair, but of release. The quiet explosion of betrayal had shattered my past, but in the stillness that followed, I could sense the first sparks of something new, my own story waiting to be written beyond these walls. I settled into the stiff motel chair, the thin walls humming with the drone of distant traffic, and stared at the laminated sign offering breakfast at 7. The bedspread beneath me was scratchy, floral pattern faded, the room smelling slightly of mildew and stale carpet. I closed the motel door with a soft click and let my overnight bag drop to the floor. My shoulders sagged as I sank onto the edge of the mattress, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on me like an anchor. I'd watched my life unravel in the windows of my own cabin, heard my memories rehearsed by a stranger's lips, and witnessed the scene that would haunt me forever. Yet here, in this anonymous room with its single lamp and bland wallpaper, I found a strange kind of relief. No photographs on the walls to remind me of who I was, no whisper of laughter echoing through pine trees. Just solitude. I closed my eyes and pictured April's face. The moment her smile faltered when she saw me at her door, the tears streaming down her cheeks as she confessed to another love. I remembered Julian's startled expression, the tangle of guilt and disbelief in his eyes. When I left the cabin, I felt like a ghost walking away from the ruins of a life I once believed indestructible. But I also felt something else, a flicker of possibility, a sense that the story I'd lived so far had been an illusion, that the real narrative was still unwritten. I slid my hand into my pocket and pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over my contacts. The condo, the office, my colleagues, they all felt like distant strangers. I closed the phone and set it aside. I didn't belong there anymore. Not yet. I rose and crossed to the window, peeling back the curtain to reveal the parking lot's fading neon glow. A single sedan sat under a flickering lamp, its paint dull with dust. Beyond it, the city skyline rose like a promise I wasn't ready to claim. The motel sign buzzed overhead, its letters spelling vacancy in sporadic pulses. I breathed in, letting the cool night air seep in through the cracked window frame. Somewhere beyond those lights, my friends and co-workers slept soundly, unaware that the man they thought they knew was at a crossroads. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt the heartbeat of the world outside, a rhythm I had lost sight of in the cabin's cocoon of woods and water. I picked up my bag and emptied it onto the bed. A change of clothes, the photo album, the note April left, and my wallet. I examined the folded paper again, tracing her familiar handwriting. Please don't come back until you hear from me. The words felt like a challenge. She needed space to think, but I needed something more than empty corridors and sterile towels. I needed connection, clarity, direction. I grabbed the photo album, sat on the bed, and leafed through the images. Our engagement day. Her laugh as she held the diamond. The first Christmas at the cabin. Both of us bundled in scarves, rosy-cheeked, eyes bright with promise. Each picture was a relic of who I once was, but also a reminder of my own resilience. I closed the album, tapped it shut, and placed it gently on the nightstand. I could not resurrect what was lost, but I could honor what had been real. A soft knock at the door made me flinch. I set the album aside and opened the door a crack. Tobias stood there, cab uniform damp from rain, hat in hand, concern etched in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I exhaled, forced a wry smile. "I think so." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I figured you might need someone to talk to," he said. I gestured to the chair beside the bed. He sat heavily, gaze drifting to the photo album. "That your place?" he asked gently. I nodded. "My cabin." His eyes softened. "Hope you find what you're looking for." I paused, then said, "I need perspective. I need to know that there's something out there beyond betrayal." He nodded, filling the room with a kindness I hadn't expected. Sometimes distance helps. Sometimes you need to get lost before you can find your way back. I stood and crossed to the dresser, took out a notepad I used for work and scribbled a single line. What comes next? The question pulsed at the center of my mind, an ember glowing amid ashes of heartbreak. I tore the page free and handed it to Tobias. "What would you do?" He read the words, looked up at me. "I'd give myself a chance to breathe," he said. "Rebuild in small steps. Reach out to people who matter. Be honest about what you need." He smiled gently. "And maybe call an old friend. Someone who reminds you who you were before the world tried to rewrite your story." His words settled around me, a balm against the storm. I folded the page carefully and tucked it into my jacket. "Thank you," I said, meaning every syllable. He nodded, lingered for a moment, then slipped out the door as quietly as he'd arrived. I closed the door behind him, leaned against it, and exhaled. The motel room felt less like a cage now, more like a blank slate waiting for the first strokes of a new chapter. I returned to the window and watched the city lights blur through the mist, each flicker a possibility. I realized I didn't need to decide tonight. I could stay here for as long as I needed, days, weeks, until I found the threads of my next story weaving into place. I felt a quiet strength rising, a conviction that my life's narrative was mine to script. I opened the photo album one more time, tracing the edges of April's smile with gentle fingers. I whispered into the hush, "Thank you for what we had," and closed it for good. I switched off the lamp, letting the neon sign's glow filter through the curtains. I sat on the bed, back against the headboard, and let exhaustion claim me. My last thought before sleep found me was that when dawn broke over Lake Revere, I would choose whether to return, and if I did, it would be on my terms. If I didn't, then I would step into whatever new story awaited, unafraid, ready to write the next line. And with that promise, I drifted into a rare, untroubled sleep, cocooned in possibility rather than betrayal. Morning light filtered through the motel curtains when my phone buzzed. A message from April. "Please answer me." I stared at it, thumb hovering over reply before locking the screen. I needed time clarity, not another flood of apologies. I slipped out of bed, dressed in the same jeans and jacket I'd worn yesterday, and grabbed my bag. I had one intent today: face this head on. Back at the cabin, the gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the porch. Tobias's cab sat empty, its engine cooled, taillights dull. I stepped inside without knocking, heart steady. Sunlight pooled on the rug. The wine glass lay on the sill, dried wine staining the wood. April stood in the living room, pale in her gray sweater, shoulders tight. Julian paced behind her, eyes red-rimmed, guilt etched into his posture. They froze at my arrival as though the doors slammed on their world. I held her gaze first. "We need to talk," I said evenly. She swallowed. Julian backed away, uncertain what role he should play. "Miles," April began, voice quivering, "I'm so sorry." My throat tightened. "I don't want your sorry," I said, stepping inside. "I want the truth." She swallowed again, glanced at Julian, and turned back to me. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said. "But I realize now I betrayed you." I nodded once. "You did." Julian cleared his throat. "Miles, I never knew she was married." His plea hung in the air, half defensive. I didn't look at him. I focused on April. "Did you love him?" I asked. Her eyes filled. "Yes." My chest felt hollow. "And me?" She hesitated, tears pooling. She closed her mouth. I waited. "Finally, I loved you too." The admission cracked like fragile glass. I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly. "Why?" I asked. "Why wasn't I enough?" She shook her head. "You are everything." But we drifted. I thought of long nights she'd fallen asleep beside me in silence, of my excuses for work. "So you traded our silence for his words?" Tears rolled down her cheeks. I felt heard with him. I nodded, understanding too well the ache of loneliness. "You should have told me." She fell silent. I turned to Julian. "You knew about us?" He shook his head. "She said she was single." I let the words hang. "She lied to both of us." Julian's face fell. April's shoulders sank. I felt pity for him and sorrow for her. I looked at the framed photo over the mantel. Our smiling faces by the lake, years ago. I stepped forward and lifted it from the wall. Dust drifted in the beam of sunlight. "Memories," I said quietly, "shouldn't be stolen." I set it on the coffee table. April moved toward me. "Miles, please." I held up my hand. "Do not." I stepped back. I needed to see this. I gestured around the room, our home, his borrowed stage. "To know it's real." She nodded, tears shining. "Then what now?" I met her gaze. "I'm leaving." The words were calm but final. She opened her mouth, but no argument came. Julian lingered by the door, guilt and shame competing on his face. I picked up my bag. "I'm going back to the city," I said. "I need space to rebuild alone." April's tears fell freely now. "Miles," I shook my head gently. "I need distance from this life you and I built." I paused at the door, turning once more to look at them. "I hope you find peace," I said, and closed the door behind me. Outside, I took a deep breath of pine-scented air. Tobias appeared at the edge of the clearing, engine idling. I climbed in without a word. As he drove away, I watched the cabin recede, its windows reflecting an ended chapter. The silence in the cab was profound, not void, but full of possibility. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, eyes on the winding road ahead. My heart stung, but I felt certain I would rebuild on my own terms. And for the first time since the betrayal, I felt free. The sunrise was pale and tentative, casting silver light over the rain-dampened road as Tobias's cab carried me away from the cabin and the wreckage of my past life. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching mist swirl among the pine trunks, each tree a silent witness to the nights and mornings I'd spent plotting out our future. Now they stood aloof and unyielding, guardians of memories I could no longer trust. I exhaled, feeling the last tendrils of anger slip away, leaving behind a hollow I wasn't afraid to fill with something new. We passed the old bridge where I'd watched the water lap against weathered boards, the place I'd reclaimed my voice after Julian's rehearsed declarations. I blinked back the stab of nostalgia and let my gaze drift instead to the horizon, where the city skyline shimmered like an invitation. I thought of April's note, her plea for space, and her message on my phone, begging me to talk. I didn't respond. Not yet. Today, I would choose silence over another wave of apologies, distance over distraction. I needed time to recalibrate, to remember how it felt to be just me. No husband, no betrayed soul, simply a man searching for his next chapter. Tobias navigated the winding road with quiet expertise. He caught my eye in the rearview mirror. "Ready for coffee anywhere?" he asked. I nodded. "Somewhere busy." I wanted the hum of strangers, the camaraderie of shared laughter and inconsequential chatter. A bustling diner off the highway caught my attention, neon sign, steaming cups visible through the window. Tobias pulled in, and I climbed out, breathing in the scent of bacon and syrup. Inside, the diner was filled with early risers, a group of truckers comparing routes, a couple sharing newspapers, and a waitress who greeted me with a practiced smile. I slid into a booth by the window and watched the world resume around me. The waitress brought coffee before I'd ordered it, black, strong, served in a chipped ceramic mug that felt warm and solid between my hands. I took a long sip, relishing the bitterness that cleared the last fog from my mind. I fingered the edge of my wedding band in my pocket, then slid it onto the table. It clinked softly against the formica, a quiet farewell. I closed my eyes, felt the mug's warmth seep into my palms, and let the moment settle. The ring was a symbol of what I'd lost, but also of what I'd once been: hopeful, committed, capable of love. Now, it was time to be capable of myself again. I reached for my phone and opened my contacts. I scrolled past April's name without stopping, pausing on Lana, instead, an old friend whose laughter had once felt like sunlight. I tapped her name, thumb hovering over call. My heart fluttered as it had before every big decision I'd ever made. I dialed. The ringing echoed in my ears like a starting pistol. When she answered, her familiar warmth crackling through the line, I smiled even before she said hello. We talked for hours. She listened as I unraveled the story of the cab ride, the cabin, the stolen memories, and the confrontation. She didn't judge. She shared her own recent stumble, divorce paperwork that felt like a guillotine. And we laughed at the absurdity of two people so different suddenly forced to start over. Her voice was a tether, pulling me from the wreckage to a place where hope could grow again. By the time I hung up, the sun had risen fully, golden and unwavering. I paid my tab, left the diner with a sense of momentum, and climbed back into Tobias's cab. I watched the ring in my jacket pocket, felt its weight shift from burden to talisman of what once was and what could still be. "Take me to the airport," I told Tobias. "I'm flying home." He nodded, and the cab pulled onto the highway. As we accelerated toward the horizon, I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of wheels on pavement carry me forward. The betrayed memories and broken promises would always be part of my story, but they no longer defined me. Ahead lay the unknown, a city that held both familiar streets and unexplored paths, a life waiting to be reimagined. I inhaled deeply, tasted freedom on the air, and whispered into the dawn, "This is my story now." And with that declaration, I stepped fully into what would come next.